Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here and welcome back to another patch retrospective video. I've been getting comments asking when the Stormblood retrospective was going to happen, and given that December is wide open while we're waiting for JP Fan Fest in January, I figured what better time than to crank these out for you, so hopefully you'll be watching all of them throughout the month. So for this video, we're going to be jumping into the launch of Stormblood, how it was received, how people felt about the story, any issues it may have had, all of the same stuff that we did for the previous expansion. And it's a pretty important thing to look at, because if you've watched my Heavensward retrospectives, it's basically a lot of me talking about how Heavensward, while it's remembered for its fantastic story, its music, and a few high points here or there, was really troublesome for Final Fantasy XIV. Again, so much so to the point where I was genuinely worried the game was going to die. People talk about that now with Endwalker. Nothing, absolutely nothing compared to how the game was in patch 3.1 and how a lot of the patches afterwards did not fix it at a fast enough pace. But with Stormblood, as with any expansion, it's kind of a chance at a new lease on life. You get to look at everything, make massive adjustments, send us into this new environment, new raid series, new way of thinking. And that's what Stormblood had to do. And while I'm going to get into the specifics of these details throughout the next several videos in this series, Stormblood is to this day considered the pinnacle of content for Final Fantasy XIV, the expansion that defines what a full of content expansion can look like for the game, even after Shadowbringers and after Endwalker. So I'm really excited to do this part of the series, and I hope you're excited to hear about it. So with Stormblood's release, we saw a lot of massive changes, but let's go through some of the familiar stuff first. It of course had its main scenario quest, it had its two trials, and that of Lakshmi and Susanoo, plus the normal mode of Shinryu, and it had a variety of dungeons, most of which were largely enjoyed. This stuff is standard from expansion to expansion, so you really have to judge the individual bits based on their pros and cons. And this is probably the weakest part of Stormblood for the entirety of the expansion, largely because Stormblood was riddled with connection issues upon its release, more than we've ever seen, more than Endwalker, more than Shadowbringers, and more than both of the expansions and the re-release that came before. So much so that so many memes propped up, things that are still alive to this day that now as a distant memory are funnier than they are depressing. The biggest one is Cold Steel. It's one of the earliest quests that you get in the Stormblood MSQ, and it became a gathering point of people who could not progress any further due to a solo instance and issues with all instances in the game and getting players through the instance lobby. Players created lines, players swarmed around the enemies, people would just try in batches. You'd hear one person say, "I got through," and everyone would go to the NPC and try to get it done. Then you had people actually die in the quest and have to wait 5, 10, maybe 2, 3 days, 5, 10 hours, 2, 3 days. It was a nightmare. And that's hardly even the only thing that went wrong with that Stormblood release. One of the other things was that I think it's if you were in the middle of an emote or on a mount when you entered an instance, upon exiting the instance, your character would basically be sent to a null void and you would be forcefully logged out of the game and not be able to log back in. I forgot what they had to do to fix that, but I remember people running into it a lot going into the Susanoo quest because people were in the water, and I guess being on a mount in the water, which we'll talk about in a bit too, actually counted for that kind of condition that would kick you out. It was really, really strange, but those were kind of the pinnacle of issues of Stormblood and things that did actually carry through for a little too long. So if there's one major criticism it got, it's definitely in how the servers handled the game. And it's surprising because after Heavensward, you wouldn't think there'd be that much of a problem with it. You know, you wouldn't think that there was just be this massive congregation after how much people had a hard time kind of sitting through Heavensward various patches to get to Stormblood, but that expansion hype's always there. And what are you going to do about it? They just had to do whatever they could, and it took too long, and it really wasn't enough. But if this is the lowest point of the expansion, I'll take it. And all the other bells and whistles were still there. I mean, if you've played since Endwalker's release, you're probably aware of, the side quests, the job quests, Crafter and Gatherer changes. But of course, there are some highlights amongst that. Amongst the job quests, Red Mage and Samurai were added. Our first expansion that put 2 DPS in the forefront. We're going to be getting our second one with Dawn Trail, and I can say from experience, this wasn't as bad on the queues as people thought. And it's going to be even less bad this time because we have the trust system nowadays. Red Mage was very well received upon release, and Samurai was okay, but being a selfish melee DPS when Black Mage had struggled with being a selfish caster was a bit of a stretch for a lot of people. However, really good Samurai players carved out a name, and the job just needed a little bit of help getting into the forefront before groups really stopped criticizing it. So a double DPS release actually went fairly well, I would say. Level cap raised to 70. They added job gauges like we have nowadays. That started with Stormblood. And one other thing they added was duty actions. This was where basically an individual duty could add like a bonus button, and it could ask you to do a very specific action. They used it in raids. They used it in trials. We see something similar to it with Eureka, with Bozia. So it's not like something that's been completely abandoned, but it's something they introduced and very seldom use, because the way they tried to force it upon players with encounters wasn't the best received, even though I think they were creative with it at some points. And I do think there are merits to having a button or an action like this. The whole separate action bar and like having to bind that in particular versus it just being something you can drag and drop and put in a really comfortable place and maybe having to do rebound. It definitely struggled a bit. And I think that's somewhat due to Final Fantasy XIV having as many buttons as it does. Overall, though, most of these changes were very well enjoyed. There's a few that people definitely were kind of shaky about, especially Machinist on the initial release. But all the same, those were adjustments that would come later. They would make adjustments to these jobs that would kind of fill in those gaps that they still had in their development. And they tried a bunch of new things. We're going to get into that in a little bit too. And then, of course, Crafter and Gatherer changes, like I mentioned. I actually forgot about the whole scripts thing. Not that scripts existed, but that they were doing them like Tombstone style, where it was like, oh, yellow scripts are your new capped script, and then, blue scripts are going to be removed and red scripts are going to be in place, and red scripts are no longer going to be like, they were basically doing the same cycle where they move one of them out of relevancy, move the previous capped script down, and then move a new one in. They would do that again with white, and I haven't really kept up with Crafter and Gatherer scripts since. But another thing was that the yellow Crafter scripts were available on patch, and the yellow Gatherer scripts were added later on. So there's all sorts of really weird things there, but the changes they generally made were mostly quality of life to crafters and gatherers. They, of course, did add spearfishing, which unfortunately has been pretty much abandoned, and a lot of people want it back. So this was the origin of spearfishing, and it kind of just didn't get to go anywhere after that, or at least nowhere of significance. Far from the only things that happened with the combat and crafter-gatherer systems, though. Major overhauls to the way that jobs were, and I put this in quotes, customizable. Sub-job requirements for unlocking jobs completely removed. Before Stormblood, you needed a second class at level 15 in order to unlock your job at level 30. That was gone. The cross-class system as a whole was gone and was replaced with role actions, which we still have to this day, but obviously they would undergo changes throughout the rest of the expansions and patches and whatnot. Attribute points. Prior to this, you could customize up to 30 attribute points to put them into whatever stat you wanted. Strength, vitality, the main stats, essentially. That was gone because people were just making decisions, and if people made the wrong decision, they were chastised by other people, and there was just a chance to be wrong. So they took away all the chances for you to make the wrong decision with a lot of this stuff. And again, between that, the job gauges, and a bunch of various other changes they would make to the individual jobs, Stormblood is very regularly considered to be the pinnacle of job design. They had kind of brought it into the modern era that we see now, but not so modern that it was homogenized to the point where we see now. Jobs had a very distinct identity and play style. They all felt drastically different, and their means of actually getting their power, when their power points were all vastly different. So depending on what type of composition you had, it more drastically changed how you had to align all of the buffs that people were doing. And that's something that would then carry over into Shadowbringers. So Stormblood really got us on an ideal design, and then I think Shadowbringers would perfect it later. Then we've got a bunch of other changes. Honestly, I'm just going to name some of the significant quality of life stuff. EXP bonus to Fates. I think this goes unappreciated because a lot of people only do Fates at the start of the expansion, and very rarely do they dabble with them later, even as an alternate leveling method. Not only did they add the occasional EXP bonus to Fates, but this is where they added those mobs that give you the Twist of Fate buff. Basically, two types of mobs can spawn during a Fate, and this is true to this day. One of them's a small one of them's a big one. And if you kill them, the next Fate gives you bonus EXP. So what you would regularly try to do is clear the Fates that have those and then go to the EXP bonus Fates and then use those there. Although I don't think that was actually like a benefit. I'm pretty sure that all of the buffs are based on the base value of the Fates, but that's just kind of how people ended up doing it. And this little kind of resurgence to Fate popularity after Heavensward, Fates were kind of just like people did them for their Atmas, but they weren't really cared about much at all, was appreciated, at least for people who wanted to dive into this. And I'm kind of glad to see whenever they do make small innovations to the Fate system, because I think it could be more fun and more engaging, but there's just, it's hard to convince people to do these hours and hours on end. You also had the Shirogane housing instance added. It didn't have houses right away, but they did add the zone so people could go check it out. And they also basically doubled indoor housing totals across all the different sizes, which is something people always appreciate. And one of the biggest changes I completely forgot just looking through my list here, weakness and brink adjustments. So, you know, when you die and you get resurrected, you get weakness. If you die and then get resurrected again with weakness, you get brink of death. Originally, it reduced all of your attributes, including vitality, by a set amount, by 15 for weakness and 30% for brink. This meant that if you died, your max HP was decreased, meaning you were more likely to die again. So it was kind of this cascading effect that was just awful. In Stormblood, it got changed to just being your main stat, although they also made it 25% of your main stat. So that way your vitality wouldn't be decreased and it wasn't this constant repunishment that you would have to deal with. A very important change. Speaking of important stat changes, substats got a massive overhaul in Stormblood. This is where they started doing the role-specific stats, even though I feel like they still haven't fully committed to this idea all these years later. This is when tanks got the tenacity stat for the first time. This is when direct hit replaced accuracy, so accuracy being gone was a huge deal going into Stormblood. And Piety was originally max MP. It's different now, but when it was first released and it was made no longer a main stat, it instead was for healers increasing their max MP. They also made things like skill speed affecting auto attacks, and most importantly in my eyes, outside of accuracy, blocks and parries no longer being frontal, and blocking working on magic. That was such a tease, because in the Heavensward, I think it's the benchmark for Heavensward, there's a part where a paladin literally blocks a fireball from Nidhogg, and it wasn't something you could do in game. There was no way to block magic. It took all the way till Stormblood before that little benchmark detail that they threw in actually became a reality, and it was something that was so needed after how much Paladin was chastised throughout the entirety of Heavensward for not being able to deal with magic. What's some other quality of life? Assuneable debuff. So like if you could Asuna a debuff, that little line over it, that was added at the start of Stormblood. Before then, it was just guessing if you could Asuna it, which was not fun. MP and TP full restoring on wipe. It's funny this took till Stormblood, because in 3.4 they made it so all of your cooldowns reset on wipe, but your MP and your TP didn't. In Stormblood, they then made it so also the MP and TP would full restore on wipes. It's funny it took that long. More raid markers got added in. This is another huge one. Progress bars and action names on the enmity list. So have you ever used the enmity list to see if something is casting an action, even if you're not targeting it? Or maybe there's like targets that are dive bombing along the outside or casting spells, untargetable things like staves or other dragons. That was added in Stormblood, so you could track those things with the enmity list. Huge thing that is still very relevant to this day. They doubled the amount of macro space you had. Oh my goodness, I almost forgot about this. So Palace of the Dead was introduced in Heavensward, and Yoshi P regularly talked about the odds of people soloing all 200 floors and how he didn't think it was possible. There was no achievement in the game for soloing to floor 200 at that point. No Necromancer title at all. With the addition of Red Mage, also came the addition of the Necromancer achievement. They had to have known Red Mage was going to be capable of it by adding this in. And to boot, they also added sustaining potions for Palace of the Dead. To me, these two things, the Necromancer achievement and the sustaining potions for Palace, this is what gave us the awesome Palace of the Dead community that exists now. Before then, it was a pipe dream people were trying, but it wasn't even kind of close. Now, Red Mage would get in, and then everyone just has to start thinking, can this other job do it? What's the benefit of this? How do I do it with this job and that job? And as job adjustments got made and patches released and more jobs started getting through, this is really the birth of that community, and will only be bolstered further in Stormblood with some other things coming out. And for on release, well, there's just so many things like housing and aquariums and new furnishings and gear, and all this stuff. I can't go through everything. There's also a ton of PvP adjustments. They removed like 4 different modes. The fold was finally removed. It was basically like a 1-life 4v4 deathmatch that we had. That was our first ever PvP mode. The light party queue for the feast, you know, queuing with a pre-made group of 4 against another pre-made group of 4 was removed here. And then also Borderline Ruin Slaughter. Basically, again, a deathmatch mode, but it was the 72-man, you know, team v team v team deathmatch. Those were all removed at the release of Stormblood. On top of that, they removed a lot of other PvP attributes like morale, action points, the different class use and spells that you had. Spells no longer being interrupted, diminishing returns on crowd control. All of that started Stormblood. Not to mention, the most important thing, they added PvP-only skills. Up to this point, PvE skills had to be adjusted separately for PvP, but you had all of your PvE skills. Now, it was just, you went in on a job, no class shenanigans, and you had PvP-only skills. Those one button that does like the whole combo and everything you have now, that started here. So you have Stormblood to thank for that. Again, I could keep going on because Stormblood's quality of life on release was really, really good. And again, outside of those major problems with Cold Steel and the other instances, it went pretty good for the release, at least as good as it's going to go. Obviously, the release of an expansion always comes with content-related issues because there's usually not as much. They're letting people slowly get through the MSQ, level multiple jobs, work on crafting, work on gathering. They're not focused on like massive long-term content yet. But trust me, Stormblood would become known for that. But in patch 4.01, which is just 2 weeks after the release of the expansion, that's when they usually add a few things. In this case, they added one thing that was a big surprise, but a couple of things that we expected as well. The normal mode of Omega Deltascape was introduced, and the start of the Omega Raid series, what I like to call a little bit too much fandom, where they've just created excuses to add bosses from other Final Fantasy games, ones that they may not have ever added otherwise. Wasn't a big fan of Deltascape from a story perspective, but from a raid perspective, well, I guess we can wait to talk about the Savage, because normal mode was just okay. It was a normal mode. What else is there to really say? They also added those yellow gatherer scripts like I mentioned earlier, and something they did in 4.01 that I don't know why they've never repeated. The final dungeon of the MSQ had the Magitech Reaper mount added as a potential drop. I think it's called the Magitech Reaper. Essentially, it is the only dungeon in Final Fantasy XIV, the only 4-player, just casual dungeon, not Criterion or Variant or any of that stuff, that just has a potential mount drop at the end. Do you know how much people love dungeons with ultra rare mounts? Why would you not find ways to continue to do this ever again? I think it's because Alamigo was a pretty long dungeon and they wanted to incentivize it more to make sure people would still help people complete the MSQ as it got kind of pushed to the wayside as newer stuff came out. But you got it. You can't tell me that the minions we have now are sufficient. If you had another mount to dungeons, people will go nuts for it. It's content. It's collection. Collection is content in MMOs. So Stormblood, you get credit for that, but I can't give it too much credit because it never happened again. And then just another 2 weeks later, 4.05, which again comes with the usual bells and whistles. It had Tomes of Creation. That's, you know, their weekly capped tome for the start of the expansion. It had PvP adjustments, you know, just to make sure some finer details were ironed out. You know, it's some basic stuff. It had the Lost Canals of Uznair, which was a treasure dungeon. You know, in Heavensward, they got the Aquapolis. Here was Lost Canals of Uznair. And treasure dungeons are fantastic. It is content that has been supported since its release. And while they haven't really innovated on it in quite some time, and hopefully they will in Dawn Trail, it is always nice to get that next bit so you can gather up your friends and go do the newer treasure dungeons that have come out. There's also a mass amount of job adjustments, tank stances, and swapping them. Really popular during Stormblood, really popular during Heavensward. Really more popular to just stay in the DPS one, but anyway, let's not talk about that too much. Swapping would actually cut your gauge in half, so people didn't really like doing it. They got rid of that. They made buffs to Warrior. They made buffs to Dark Knight. Warrior in particular really needed it. Their gauge use was terrible. Steel Cyclone also got some auto healing added to it whenever you use Steel Cyclone. So Warrior got some much needed buffs. Dark Knight got a few small ones. Dragoon, however, needed a massive amount of help because with Life of the Dragon being added in this, well, no, it wasn't Life of the Dragon being added. It was Blood of the Dragon. No, it was a Blood of the Dragon. They made a lot of changes. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but Dragon Sight, you know, people didn't like how short the range was on it and how unusable it felt. they made some adjustments to that to make it easier. Animation locks on Mirage Dive were greatly reduced, and Blood of the Dragon and maintaining it were made a decent bit easier just this month later. Dragoon was not in great shape prior to this, and after this, they were in fantastic shape, and they would continue to get buffs throughout the rest of the expansion, so they really couldn't complain. Machinist got a huge overhaul to the way its heat generation and management worked, so much so that it felt like a different job a month later. I wasn't actually a huge fan of it after they made these adjustments, but it made it very usable for people who would go on to be Machinist mains, as infrequent as they were throughout the entirety of Stormblood. Black Mage got a little bit of ease of use, Foul having its MP cost removed, Black Mage cast time reductions, and triple cast being the 60 seconds, something we still get to enjoy to this day. White Mage had like a complete rework of plenary indulgence. You only procced on single target cures. Nobody uses single target cures unless you're desperate. So they changed it to the Medica 2 version that we had for a while. And nowadays we have the Confession stack. So it's gone on to change even since then. But yeah, I mean, they had to make some pretty major changes to the White Mage skills back then too. Scholar also, dude, I swear the start of every expansion, they try to neuter Scholar, and then they just completely 180 because people love Scholar and they don't want it to be neutered. Happened here again. You know, they had to buff its healing potencies. They had to lower some of its cooldowns, increase the range of the Fey Union tether. The quickened ether flow, they made it 100%, but cut the amount of time that it was reduced. And Miasma too. They added the instant cast AoE dot back in, so... and then Astro also got some nerfs to their card potencies, except for the Spear, which got made into crit rate at this point, something that was long overdue, so it was appreciated. But of course, all those job adjustments were to go with Omega Savage. This tier was enjoyed. Specifically, this is Omega Deltascape Savage. It's kind of a weird tier in memory. So on content, it was laughed at a good bit. It was the first raid of the expansion, and it was designed as a first raid for the expansion. In stark contrast to Gordius, which murdered everyone, this fell over very, very quickly. And when I say very quickly, the first boss, Altroit, on Savage, was beaten in a single pull. No wipe, they just YOLO'd through it and beat it, because it was very similar to the normal mode, just with no walls and a few less indicators. No boss has ever been beaten nearly as quickly as Altroit on content. So that is a joke. The second boss, Catastrophe, was actually an awesome boss. Little bit weird and cryptic to figure out on content, but still done very, very well. On top of that, it had the use of a duty action, which allowed you to control the gravity of your character, lifting them off the ground, and you had to use that at the correct time in order to do mechanics. The duty action and the clunkiness of it kind of add it to more of a negative memory, but the creativity of this boss was really on point and shows the potential that duty actions could have had if they had mastered it and figured out exactly what they wanted to do with it, not largely abandon it, which kind of glad they did, but also sort of disappointed. The third boss, Halicarnassus, is to this day one of the most beloved Savage bosses we've ever had, one of the most praised third bosses that we've ever had, and is a great time to go back. If you ever have the opportunity to do a low item level run of Omega Deltascape, if you don't know what that is, go and Google it. It's also on my YouTube channel. I highly recommend doing it because it is a very well-paced, fast, fun, and furious fight. And of course, X-Death and Neo X-Death were also really much enjoyed by everyone except Tanks. Tanks weren't a huge fan of Neo X-Death, but the music, the intensity of the fight were all very much enjoyed. It did begin to show the cracks of a Stormblood design flaw, especially with final bosses, of repeating the final 50% of the fight a second time instead of having new mechanics occur in the back half of the fight. It basically meant that progging half of a fight meant progging the whole fight, which is a really, really weird thing when it came to working on, you know, Race for World First, or even just trying to progress and have fun the entire time. This encounter was also Final Fantasy XIV's first execution of what we now call a door boss. I don't want to call it the first door boss ever, because Faust exists and all of the Heavensward tiers have a Faust equivalent, which is more like a mini boss before the actual boss. This is like a fully fleshed out first boss, and then checkpointing you to the second boss, which you have to beat before the instance is over. To this day, many people who were around back then consider this the best execution of that concept, regardless of how you feel about the individual bosses. It's about a little bit under 5-minute first boss encounter into the 12-ish minute second encounter. Nowadays, more often we get like a 7.5-minute door boss into like an 8.5-minute second phase boss. So it's just kind of weird the way the time is split now. It's not even like a door boss. It's just literally like phase 1 and phase 2, or first boss and second boss inside the instance. So regardless, again, of how you feel about the boss, I still think this is the best way that they've ever done a door boss. And there are quite a few people from back then who feel the same way, but that's up to you. I'm just kind of inserting a little bit of opinion and, I guess, perspective into how it was perceived back then and is still perceived now. But overall, it was a pretty enjoyed tier. Most people would look back on Deltascape with fond memories, just with a little bit of a chuckle at Alt-Roy and a little bit of a wince at Catastrophe. And that is such a stark contrast to the start of Heavensward, where not only was it that same sort of issue of there really wasn't a lot of game systems in place to support the content at the time. Yes, there was the hunt, and yes, there were technically treasure maps, but we didn't have the treasure dungeon at the start of Heavensward, and here we were getting a brand new one at the start. Massive PvP changes in Heavensward didn't happen for a couple of patches. Here, they made sure they happened right from the get-go. Job adjustments were pretty much on point. They made sure to add a mount to that last dungeon. They added all sorts of new exploration. They gave more benefit to things like fates, the substat. All of these things were things that were largely based on feedback, were largely needed, and at least somewhat help to make us forget about the Cold Steel problems. But I did mention one thing. I said earlier the Cold Steel problems wouldn't be over when Cold Steel's problems were over. And this was particularly true with Omega. The normal modes for both the first and second tier contained very long solo instances. So the same thing that happened with Cold Steel, to a lesser degree, happened with Omega Normal. Now, fortunately, Savage wasn't until a couple of weeks later for the first tier. For the second tier, not so fortunate, where people did indeed have a little bit of a hang-up getting through the normal modes. And this is a lesson they've long since learned. We've seen them make changes since then, so it's good to see that while these were issues back then, they've been trying very hard to get away from them since, even if, as we've seen with Endwalker, they weren't always successful. But that's going to be my retrospective on the start of Stormblood. And again, while the story some people aren't a huge fan of, and I get that's why some people say Stormblood was the worst expansion, from a pure content perspective, it started strong and it would only get stronger. And that's crazy to think that as this expansion went on, it just got more and more loved. And I can't wait to talk about it. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap for this retrospective. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to let me know what you thought of Stormblood, or what your thoughts are hearing back on my memories of it in the comment section below. And be on the lookout for patches 4.1 through 4.5 throughout the month of December. Anyway, with that, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.